A single pinch of salt, scooped from the wet mud of a beach, once terrified the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Not an army, not a bomb, not a rebel with a gun, a handful of salt. And the men who ruled a quarter of the entire planet were so frightened of it that they threw 60,000 people into prison trying to stop it. 60,000. Over salt. Sit with how absurd that sounds for a moment. Salt. The cheapest, most ordinary thing in the world. The stuff sitting on your table right now, so common you would not think twice about spilling it. And yet, there was a morning in 1930 when one old man bent down on an Indian beach, lifted a fistful of salty earth into the air, and with that simple gesture struck a blow that echoed across the entire globe. To understand why, you have to understand what salt actually was in that time and place. Not a seasoning, not a luxury, a matter of life and death. Because salt is not optional for a human body. It never has been. Every beat of your heart, every twitch of a muscle, every single thought firing across your brain runs on salt. In a brutally hot climate where people sweat through their days under a punishing sun, salt is not flavor, it is survival. Lose too much of it, and your body simply stops working. So, salt is the one thing, the one truly universal thing, that every human being on earth needs and cannot live without. Rich or poor, powerful or powerless, everyone needs salt. And that is exactly what made it the perfect thing to control. Because whoever owns the salt owns the people. And in India, the British Empire owned the salt completely. They had built a monopoly so total, so suffocating, that it reached into the daily life of every single family in the country. Indians were forbidden, by law, from making their own salt. They were forbidden from selling it. They were even forbidden from picking it up off the ground where the ocean had left it drying in the sun, free, on their own shores. Imagine that. A country wrapped in thousands of miles of coastline, the sea leaving salt on the beaches for free, and the people who lived there were legally barred from touching it. They were forced instead to buy it from the very empire that ruled them, and to pay a tax on it. A tax on the one substance no human being can survive without. And that tax fell hardest, as these things always do, on the ones who could least afford it. For the poorest families in India, families already scraping to survive, the salt tax swallowed a shocking slice of what little they had. The empire had done something almost unthinkable. It had reached past land, past labor, past money, and placed a price tag on human biology itself. It taxed the very thing keeping people alive. And it backed that tax with the full force of the law, with police, with prisons. For decades, this was simply the way things were. An injustice so enormous, so woven into ordinary life, that most people had stopped even seeing it. You do not question the air you breathe. You do not question the salt in your food. The empire counted on exactly that, on the sheer ordinariness of salt to hide the theft happening in plain sight every single day. But someone was watching. Someone had looked at this quiet, invisible cruelty and seen it for what it truly was. The perfect symbol of everything wrong with an empire that ruled a nation of hundreds of millions without their consent. He saw that you could not arrest an idea, and you could not tax a beach without every hungry family understanding exactly what was being done to them. He understood that the smallest, cheapest, most ignored thing in the country might just be the one weapon an empire could not defend against. And in the spring of 1930, he decided to do the one thing the British had made a crime. He decided to make salt. Not in secret, not in the dark, but openly, deliberately, in broad daylight, in front of the newspapers and the cameras and the entire watching world, daring the most powerful empire on earth to stop him. Before we go further, if you find yourself wanting to know how a fistful of salt could possibly shake something as vast as the British Empire, subscribe. because the most ordinary objects on your table are hiding the most extraordinary histories, and I am going to show you every one of them. He was 60 years old. He walked with a wooden staff and wore a simple homespun robe. He had no army, no weapons, no fortune. And on the 12th of March, he stepped through the gates of his home and began to walk toward the sea. A journey that no one, not even his closest followers, could be certain he would survive. He stepped through the gates that morning and turned toward the sea, and the man walking at the head of that small column was already the most famous figure in India. His name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, though by then the country had given him another name, Mahatma, the Great Soul. He was 60 years old. He owned almost nothing. He wore a robe he had spun himself on a simple wooden wheel, and he had built his entire life around a single, stubborn, almost unbelievable idea: that you could defeat the most heavily armed empire on earth without ever raising a fist against it. It sounds like madness. It half sounded like madness to the people around him too, because Gandhi's plan was not to fight the British. It was to disobey them, openly, calmly, and without violence, and to keep disobeying, no matter what they did in return. No guns, no bombs, no hidden rebels in the hills, just millions of ordinary people quietly refusing to cooperate with their own oppression. He called it satyagraha, which roughly means holding firmly to truth. And for years his critics, even his allies, had asked the same question. Against an empire with soldiers and prisons and warships, what could that possibly achieve? The answer, it turned out, was hiding in a grain of salt. Because here is the genius of what Gandhi did next, and make no mistake, it was genius. When he decided to strike at the empire, he did not choose the grand targets everyone expected. He did not demand the vote. He did not seize land. He did not march on a government palace. Advisors around him were baffled by his choice. Of all the injustices crushing India, why fixate on something as small as salt? It seemed almost trivial. It seemed beneath the scale of the moment. But Gandhi understood something they did not. He understood that a revolution needs a symbol that every single person can feel in their own hands. Demand the vote, and a starving farmer in a distant village shrugs. That is a matter for lawyers and politicians in far-off cities. But tell that same farmer he is a criminal for taking what the ocean leaves free on his own shore, and suddenly the injustice is no longer an abstract idea in a newspaper. It is in his kitchen. It is on his plate. It belongs to him. Salt did not divide India along its 1,000 fault lines of religion and caste and wealth. A Hindu needed it. A Muslim needed it. The richest merchant and the poorest laborer needed exactly the same thing in exactly the same way. Gandhi had found the one grievance that belonged to everyone at once, and there was something even sharper hidden in the choice. By picking salt, Gandhi forced the empire into an impossible position. If the British cracked down hard, sending police and soldiers to stop old men and women from scooping up seawater, they would look like exactly what they were: a monstrous power beating unarmed people over a handful of dirt. But if they did nothing, if they let it slide, they would be admitting that their own laws meant nothing, that their authority could be broken by anyone willing to walk to a beach. He had built a trap with no exit. Every move the empire could make would only make it look worse. So he announced his intention out loud, to everyone, including the British themselves. He would walk from his ashram to the coastal village of Dandi, roughly 240 miles away, and there he would break the salt law with his own hands. He even wrote to the British Viceroy beforehand, laying out his plan in plain, courteous language, practically inviting them to arrest him. No secrecy, no ambush. He wanted the whole thing done in the full light of day, where the entire world could watch. On the 12th of March, 1930, it began. 79 men walked out of the ashram gates behind him, a small, ragged band of followers, most people expecting little to come of it. Some in the press dismissed it before it started. A 60-year-old man in a loincloth, planning to walk hundreds of miles under a merciless sun to pick up some seawater. What was that going to change? But as that thin line of walkers moved out onto the dusty road and pointed themselves toward the coast, something began to stir in the villages ahead of them. Word was spreading faster than they could march, and the British, watching from their offices, were about to face the exact dilemma Gandhi had designed for them, a question with no safe answer, growing more dangerous with every mile he walked. The road ahead of him was already listening. Long before Gandhi's feet reached the next village, word of him had arrived. Runners carried the news. Rumors leapt from farm to farm faster than any man could walk. By the time that thin column crested a hill and came into view, people were waiting for it. Lining the roadsides, standing on rooftops, packed into the dust at the village edge to see the old man who was walking to the sea to break the empire's law. And the walking itself was brutal. This was no gentle procession. Gandhi set a pace of roughly 12 miles a day, day after day, under a sun that turned the roads to fire. He was 60 years old, thin as a reed, moving on foot with a wooden staff across the baking plains of western India. Younger men in the column struggled, their feet blistered and split, the heat pressed down like a weight. But the old man at the front did not stop, did not ride, did not spare himself. He rose before dawn, he prayed, he spun thread on his little wheel, and then he walked. And every evening, exhausted, dust-caked, he would stop in whatever village had gathered to meet him, and he would speak. Those speeches were the real engine of the whole thing, because Gandhi was not just walking to a beach. He was walking through the heart of rural India, and at every stop he was lighting a fire. He spoke plainly, in words a farmer understood, about the tax on their salt and the empire that took it. He asked village officials who served the British to resign. Many did, stepping down on the spot, in front of their neighbors, tearing up their loyalty to the crown in public. He called on people to spin their own cloth, to refuse foreign goods, to stop obeying. And the message spread outward from that dusty road like a crack running through glass. The column swelled. What had left the ashram as a small band of 79 grew with every mile. Villagers fell in behind them. Students, farmers, laborers, women joined the march until the road behind Gandhi stretched back for miles, a river of people flowing toward the coast. Some walked only a stretch and turned back. Others stayed. But the numbers kept climbing, and each new face was another piece of evidence that this was no longer one man's strange protest. It was becoming a movement, and the world was watching all of it. This is what made the Samp March different from every rebellion that had come before. This time, the eyes of the entire planet were fixed on that road. Reporters walked alongside the column, cameras rolled, the telegraph wires hummed, carrying dispatches out of India and across oceans to newspapers in London, in New York, in cities that had never heard of the villages Gandhi was passing through. Day after day, the world read the same astonishing story. An unarmed old man, walking hundreds of miles, defying an empire and gathering a nation behind him with every step. The British could not hide it. They could not spin it. It was unfolding in the open, in real time, in front of witnesses they did not control. And that was precisely the problem sitting on the desks of the men who governed India. Because the longer that march went on, the worse their choices became. Every mile Gandhi walked, the crowds grew larger, the headlines grew louder, and the eyes of the world pressed harder against them. They could feel the trap tightening. Arresting him now, with the whole world watching, with tens of thousands of people falling in behind him, what would that look like? And letting him reach the sea, letting him stand on a beach and openly break their law with the cameras rolling, what would that look like? They had no good answer. only bad ones, and worse ones. And in offices in Delhi and telegrams to London, that unbearable question was being asked over and over as the days ticked down. What, exactly, do we do about the old man and the sea? The men who ruled India were paralyzed, and they knew it. For weeks now, the question had been passing back and forth between Delhi and London, and no one wanted to be the one to answer it. The Viceroy of India, the single most powerful official in the entire subcontinent, sat at the center of a machine built to crush any threat. An army, a police force, a legal system, prisons enough to swallow anyone who defied the crown. And against all of that machinery stood one thin old man walking slowly toward a beach. And that machine did not know how to move. Here was the trap, closed now on all sides. If they arrested Gandhi, they would create a martyr. Everyone understood this. Drag him away in chains before he ever reached the coast, and you do not stop the movement, you set it on fire. You hand a nation of hundreds of millions a hero and a grievance in the same instant, with the world's cameras there to capture the moment. Every newspaper on earth would print the same image, an empire so frightened of an unarmed old man that it had to shackle him in the road. The British had spent decades cultivating a picture of themselves as reasonable, civilized rulers. That picture would not survive it. But the other road was no better. If they did nothing, if they simply let him walk to the sea and scoop up salt and break their law in the open, then the law itself was finished. Every subject in India would see it plainly. The empire's rules could be broken by anyone with the courage to walk to a beach, and nothing would happen. Authority is a kind of spell. It works only as long as people believe in it, and Gandhi was about to demonstrate in front of the entire world that the spell could be broken by hand. So they hesitated. They debated. Telegrams flew back and forth across half the planet while the days bled away. Some officials pushed for arrest, others warned it would be a catastrophe. And in that hesitation, in that agonizing failure to decide, the empire revealed the very weakness it had spent generations hiding. A ruler who cannot decide how to answer a single unarmed man is not as powerful as he appears. Gandhi had exposed the fear at the center of all that might, and he had done it without lifting a finger against them. And still, every morning, he walked. The coast drew closer. You could feel the tension winding tighter with each passing day, in the swelling crowds along the road, in the frantic dispatches, in the silence from a government that could not settle on what to do. Everyone, the marchers, the watching public, the anxious officials, knew the same thing. This was building toward a single moment on a single stretch of sand, and no one could stop it from arriving. Around him, the pressure mounted in other ways. The authorities had already begun moving against the wider movement, and the threat of mass arrests hung in the air. Gandhi knew he might be seized at any hour, in the dark, dragged from the road before he ever reached the water. He half expected it. He had made his peace with prison long ago. But the British kept hesitating, kept waiting, kept hoping the whole thing might somehow burn itself out before it reached the sea. And it never did. The old man just kept walking, calm and unhurried, straight toward the confrontation they most dreaded. Then, at last, after 24 days on the road, the marching stopped. The column reached the coastal village of Dandi. The sea was there, right in front of them, the long beach stretching out under the sky, the water thick with the very salt the empire had made it a crime to touch. Thousands had gathered. The cameras were ready. Word had gone out across the country and across the world that tomorrow the old man would break the law. That night, whatever the British were going to do, they had not done it. He was still free. He was still standing on the edge of the sea. And on the morning of the 6th of April, 1930, as the sun rose over the water, Gandhi walked down to the shore and stepped into the sea. He bent down, reached into the wet mud where the sea had left its residue drying in the morning sun, and lifted a small handful of natural salt into the air. That was it. That was the whole crime. A 60-year-old man crouched at the edge of the ocean, closing his fingers around a fistful of salty earth. In any other context, it would mean nothing. A child does it at the beach without a thought. But at that moment, under those cameras, it was one of the most deliberate acts of defiance the modern world had ever seen. With that single gesture, done slowly and in full view, Gandhi broke the law of the British Empire. Someone near him captured the words he spoke as he raised it. He said that with this handful of salt, he was shaking the foundations of the empire. And it did not sound like a boast, it sounded like a fact. Because everyone standing on that beach understood exactly what had just happened. The old man had done the forbidden thing, openly, and the sky had not fallen. No soldiers had appeared to stop him. The empire, for all its power, had simply watched it happen. And that was the signal a whole nation had been waiting for. What came next moved faster than anyone could have predicted. The image in the story tore across India like a current through water. In coastal towns, ordinary people walked down to their own beaches and began doing exactly what Gandhi had done, scooping up seawater, boiling it, gathering salt from the mud with their bare hands. Not in secret, not in fear, in the open, by the thousands, and then by the tens of thousands. The single act on that one beach multiplied into a countrywide refusal to obey. People sold illegal salt in the streets. Crowds gathered to buy it, not because they needed it, but because buying it was now an act of rebellion. An entire nation had found a way to break the law together, all at once, with nothing more dangerous in their hands than a pinch of salt. And now the empire had to react. The very thing it had been so terrified of doing. The hesitation was over, and the only tool it had left was force. The arrests began, and they did not stop. The police moved in on the salt makers, on the sellers, on the crowds, and the numbers climbed to something almost impossible to believe. Before it was over, roughly 60,000 people were thrown into prison. 60,000 human beings jailed for the act of gathering salt. The jails filled and overflowed, and with every arrest, the empire proved Gandhi's point more completely than any speech ever could. This was what British rule in India actually was, stripped of its polite language and its talk of civilization, a power so frightened of ordinary people touching their own salt that it would imprison them by the tens of thousands to stop it. The whole moral picture had flipped. For decades, the British had cast themselves as the reasonable, orderly rulers and their opponents as troublemakers. Now the world saw the opposite. On one side, unarmed people quietly picking up salt. On the other, an empire filling its prisons to keep them from doing it. Every arrest was another photograph, another headline, another crack in the story the British had told about themselves for generations. They had walked straight into the trap, and now they could not climb out of it. They arrested Gandhi too, of course. In the dead of night, weeks after the assault at Dandi, they finally took him, hauling him away without charge or trial, hoping perhaps that removing the man would quiet the movement. It did the opposite. With Gandhi in prison, the campaign did not shrink. It hardened. His followers pressed on without him, and their attention turned to a place that would become the most brutal test of everything he had preached. There was a salt works up the coast, at a place called Dharasana, guarded and off-limits. And a plan was forming to march on it, to walk straight up to it in broad daylight, unarmed, and take it in the name of the people. Everyone involved knew the police were waiting there, armed and ready. They knew what was likely coming, and they decided to walk toward it anyway. They walked toward the police in silence, in neat rows, and not one of them raised a hand to defend himself. This was Dharasana, and it became the moment that broke the empire's story forever. The salt works stood behind barbed wire and lines of armed police, hundreds of officers with steel-tipped clubs, waiting. And toward them came a column of Gandhi's followers, unarmed, disciplined, calm. There were no weapons among them, no stones, no shields. They had been told exactly what to expect, and they had agreed to it. They would walk forward. They would not fight back. They would not even raise their arms to block the blows. They would simply keep walking and let the world see what happened next. What happened next was almost unbearable to witness. An American reporter named Webb Miller was there, standing close enough to see everything, and the dispatch he sent out shook readers across the planet. He described the police swinging their clubs down onto the heads of the advancing men. He described the sickening sound of the blows landing on unprotected skulls. He watched the marchers go down, struck to the ground, their skulls fractured, their shoulders shattered, and he watched the ones behind them keep advancing anyway, into the exact same fate, without flinching, without lifting a finger to protect themselves. They came in waves. A line of men would walk forward, the police would beat them down, others would move in, lift the wounded away, and then a fresh line would step up and walk into the clubs, hour after hour. Miller counted the bodies being carried off, the broken heads, the men lying unconscious in the dirt. And through all of it, not a single one of the marchers threw a punch. Not one. They took the beating and kept coming, hundreds of them, in perfect silence, until the ground was littered with the fallen. It was the most complete proof imaginable of everything Gandhi had built his life around. On one side stood men with clubs, backed by an empire, swinging with all their strength. On the other stood men who would not strike back no matter what was done to them. And there was no question, none at all, about who held the moral high ground. The violence belonged entirely to the empire. The dignity belonged entirely to the people being beaten. You could not look at Dharasana and tell yourself the old story, that the British were the calm, civilized rulers keeping order among unruly natives. That story was dead. It had died in the dirt of that salt works, in front of a reporter, whose words were about to travel everywhere, because Webb Miller's account went out across the world. It ran in newspapers on every continent. Millions of people who had never given a thought to India read, in plain and horrifying detail, what the empire was doing to unarmed men who only wanted to gather salt. And something shifted in the way the world saw British rule. The empire's greatest weapon had always been the belief that it was legitimate, that it governed by right, with reason and restraint. Dharasana destroyed that belief. In the eyes of the watching world, the empire had revealed itself as nothing more than brute force, beating down defenseless people. And an empire that has lost the world's belief in its own legitimacy has already begun to die, even if it does not yet know it. Gandhi had not stopped a single blow. He had not saved a single skull from the clubs, and yet, in the deepest sense, he had won. He had forced the empire to show its true face to the entire world, and he had done it exactly as he always said he would, without ever meeting violence with violence. The men beaten at Dharasana had not lost. They had handed the British a defeat far worse than any battle. They had taken away the thing the empire could not survive without, the illusion that it was good. The salt tax would not fall that year. Gandhi would remain in and out of prison. The struggle would grind on for years yet. But something irreversible had happened on that stretch of coast. The world had seen. And a question now hung over everything that followed. How long can any empire rule over people who have stopped being afraid of it, and who have shown the whole world that they will not strike back and will not give in? The answer to that question turned out to be not much longer at all. An empire can survive lost battles. It can survive rebellions crushed by force. What it cannot survive is a people who have stopped believing it has any right to rule them. Because once that belief is gone, no amount of soldiers or prisons can hold it together forever. That is what the walk to the sea had done. It had not broken the empire's armies. It had broken something far more important. It had broken the fear. And it had shown millions of people, in the plainest possible terms, that the mightiest empire on earth could be defied by ordinary hands, and that it had no answer for people who refused to obey and refused to fight. From that point on, the end was only a matter of time. The struggle did not finish that year or the next. There were more arrests, more negotiations, more years of pressure applied the same patient way. But the story the British had told about themselves, that they were the natural, rightful rulers of India, never recovered. 17 years after that handful of salt was lifted from the mud, in 1947, India became free. The empire that had once seemed permanent, that had ruled hundreds of millions across an entire subcontinent, folded and withdrew. And the long road to that freedom ran directly back to a thin old man walking to a beach with a wooden staff. But the salt did something even larger than freeing one country. It handed the world a new kind of weapon, one that anyone could pick up. Because what Gandhi proved on that coast was a method, not just a moment. He proved that unarmed people, if they were disciplined and patient and willing to suffer without striking back, could defeat a force that held every gun. And that lesson did not stay in India. It traveled. A young preacher in the American South studied it closely. Martin Luther King Jr. took the method Gandhi had forged and carried it into the fight against segregation. The same principle, the same refusal to answer violence with violence, the same strategy of forcing an unjust power to show its brutality to a watching world. In South Africa, that same thread ran through the long struggle against apartheid, in the movement that would one day carry Nelson Mandela's name. Across the 20th century, in country after country, people facing overwhelming power reached for the tool that Old Man had tested on an Indian beach. The Salt March became a blueprint for how the powerless could bring down the powerful without ever raising a fist. And that is the real reason a handful of salt could hide something so much larger than a tax. On the surface, it was a story about a mineral, a cheap and ordinary thing that every human being needs. Underneath, it was a story about power itself, about how power actually works and where it truly comes from. Because an empire that must control your salt controls your body, your labor, your daily bread. And a man who could break that control with his bare hands and make the whole world watch him do it, exposed the secret that every empire hopes its subjects never learn, that its power was never really its own. It was only ever borrowed from the obedience of the people it ruled. The moment they stopped giving it, the whole thing began to crumble. That is what was hiding inside that fistful of wet earth on the morning of the 6th of April. Not just a broken law, a demonstration, for anyone in the world with eyes to see, that the largest empire in history could be brought to its knees by ordinary people who simply decided they would no longer be afraid. If this story showed you something you'd never seen behind an everyday thing, subscribe and stay with the channel, because this is only the beginning. Every ordinary object around you has a hidden history like this one, a crime or a war or a secret buried inside it, and one by one, we're going to uncover them all. The next one will change the way you look at something sitting in your kitchen right now. Don't miss it.